In 1764, in the heart of Naples, Italy, a bizarre and disturbing discovery occurred during an autopsy that would later send shockwaves through the medical community. What should have been a routine post-mortem examination on the body of a young woman turned into a perplexing mystery that baffled doctors, defied scientific understanding, and ignited debates about life, death, and the very nature of human biology. The autopsy revealed something that no one could have predicted. The organs inside her body were still growing, long after death had claimed her. The idea of something growing inside a lifeless body is chilling, almost too strange to believe. Yet, this was the chilling reality faced by a group of physicians in 18th century Naples. At a time when medical science was still largely in its infancy, and ideas about life and death were often intertwined with superstition and religious beliefs, the discovery of living, growing tissue inside a corpse seemed to be a phenomenon that could not be explained by the knowledge of the time. The macabre scene of a body, cold and lifeless, with its organs inexplicably still growing, struck terror in the minds of those who witnessed it and set in motion a series of investigations, hypotheses, and debates that would span centuries. The 18th century was a period of great transition in the world of medicine. The Enlightenment was pushing the boundaries of knowledge, but the field of medicine was still caught in a struggle between ancient practices and emerging scientific thought. In many parts of Europe, the study of anatomy and dissection was still in its early stages, and theories about human biology were far from the sophisticated understanding we have today. At the time, the notion of life itself was a mystery, with some physicians believing that there was an animal spirit that resided in the body, giving it life, while others, still influenced by religious teachings, saw death as a spiritual event, a crossing into the afterlife. In Naples, a city that was a hub of scientific exploration and also home to deep-rooted Catholic traditions, the boundaries between faith and science often blurred. Physicians and scholars in the city had long been studying the human body, performing dissections, and attempting to map the mysteries of anatomy, but even they were not prepared for the discovery they would soon make. The case of the woman whose organs were found to be growing after her death was more than just an anomaly. It was a medical enigma that threatened to challenge everything that had been understood about death and the processes that followed. As the autopsy began, the doctors expected to find the usual signs of decay. In those days, when a person died, their body was expected to undergo a series of predictable changes. Rigor mortis would set in, followed by the breaking down of tissues by bacteria and enzymes. But when the dissection began, they found that this was not the case. Inside the body, they discovered that the organs, rather than decomposing, were continuing to grow. The heart, the liver, and other internal organs were not in their usual post-mortem state of decomposition. Instead, they appeared to be alive, exhibiting signs of growth as though the body was still in the process of sustaining life. The doctors who witnessed this unsettling scene were initially stunned. What could possibly explain this phenomenon? Was the body somehow defying the natural order of things? Could it be that death had not fully taken hold, and the organs were in a state of suspended animation? Or was there some other, more sinister explanation? Theories began to swirl. Some suggested the presence of some kind of mysterious life force that had not yet fully departed, while others speculated that perhaps the body had not truly died in the conventional sense. Was this some form of reanimation? Or was it something even stranger, something beyond the scope of known science? At the time, the study of human anatomy was a delicate and often controversial subject. Dissections were not universally accepted, and many viewed the practice as sacrilegious, a violation of the sanctity of the human body. The discovery of such a mysterious event during an autopsy was not only unsettling from a scientific standpoint, but it also raised ethical and religious concerns. How could something like this happen? And what did it mean for the understanding of life and death? Was this an indication that the boundaries between the living and the dead were not as clear-cut as had been previously believed? The physician who performed the autopsy, likely with a mixture of professional curiosity and horror, began to record his findings. The details of the autopsy and the strange discoveries that followed were meticulously documented, although the exact motivations for the autopsy itself remain unclear. Was it a routine dissection of a woman who had died from illness? Or was there something about her condition that had already intrigued the physicians, leading them to believe that her case was not typical? In any case, the findings of the autopsy were shocking and sent ripples through the medical community of Naples and beyond. Theories began to emerge, but there were few answers. Some proposed that the growth was an error in the decomposition process, a bizarre quirk of the human body that had never been witnessed before. Others were less charitable, claiming that the growth of organs was evidence of some kind of supernatural force at work, a divine punishment or a sign of the woman's inner life not having been fully extinguished. But whatever the explanation, the autopsy sparked a great deal of controversy. As news of the autopsy spread, it caused a stir not only in the medical world but in the public imagination as well. People were horrified, fascinated, and mystified by the idea of organs continuing to grow after death. What did this mean for the future of medical science? And more importantly, what did it say about the human soul, life, and death? Was it possible that the line between life and death was not as rigid as previously thought? And if this were true, what else about the human body and its processes remained unexplained? The events surrounding the autopsy and the mysterious growing organs became a subject of fascination, speculation, and investigation for many years to come. The questions raised by this strange discovery echoed throughout the centuries, challenging not only medical understanding but also the fundamental concepts of life, death, and the afterlife. This moment in history marked a turning point in the study of the human body, one that would eventually lead to breakthroughs in anatomy, biology, and the understanding of life and death, yet it also underscored the deep mysteries that continue to elude us, even in the present day. The legacy of the 1764 autopsy is still felt today, not just in the field of medicine but in the way we think about death and the human body. It stands as a testament to the often unpredictable nature of science and the mysteries that remain, waiting to be uncovered. What happened in Naples so many years ago remains one of the strangest and most perplexing chapters in the history of medicine, a dark mystery that still haunts our understanding of life, death, and everything in between. And as we continue to push the boundaries of science, we are reminded that some questions, no matter how many centuries pass, may never truly have answers. In the 18th century, Naples was a city that existed at the crossroads of history, science, and superstition. It was a vibrant hub in southern Italy, a city both brimming with intellectual fervor and deeply rooted in Catholic traditions. Its streets were filled with the sounds of lively marketplaces, Baroque churches, and intellectual salons, while its skyline, crowned by the looming presence of Mount Vesuvius, served as a constant reminder of the volatile forces of nature. Naples was a city where the clash between the old world and the new was ever present, a place where people still believed in divine intervention, omens, and supernatural forces, while the ideas of the Enlightenment were quietly beginning to shape the future of scientific thought. The city had long been a center of learning, especially in the realms of medicine and anatomy. Yet, in the 1700s, despite the strides made in scientific discovery, much of the human body remained a mystery. Dissections, though more common in the 18th century than in earlier eras, were still a controversial practice. The Catholic Church, which held significant sway over intellectual thought at the time, viewed the dissection of human bodies with suspicion. Many believed it was a sacrilegious act, a violation of the sanctity of life and death. The prevailing view of the time was that the body was a vessel for the soul, and tampering with it after death was seen by some as an affront to God's will. However, despite the objections, there were those in Naples, physicians, scientists, and anatomists, who believed that the dissection of the human body could unlock the secrets of life itself. Naples was home to a number of notable figures in the study of anatomy, such as Giovanni Maria Lancisi, a prominent physician who was influential in the field of anatomy and pathology. It was in this environment of intellectual curiosity, where the boundaries of the known world were constantly being tested, that the events surrounding the 1764 autopsy would unfold. During this time, medicine was caught in a transitional phase. The medical community was beginning to move away from ancient humoral theories of health, ideas that had dominated for centuries, which believed that bodily fluids and their balance determined a person's health. But even as these old beliefs started to wane, new theories were still being tested, and scientific understanding of the human body was rudimentary at best. Physicians relied on what little knowledge they had, experimenting with dissection and observation to fill in the gaps. The rise of the Enlightenment had introduced new ideas about reason and empirical study, and this burgeoning curiosity about the natural world began to challenge centuries-old understandings of biology and medicine. However, there was still much that remained mysterious and unexplained. In this atmosphere of change, medical practitioners were beginning to turn their attention to the finer details of the human body, particularly in the field of anatomy. Dissections were becoming more common, and many physicians were eager to understand the mechanisms of death and the processes of decay. But in 1764, a strange and unexplainable event occurred that would alter the course of medical history. The city's physicians were unprepared for what they would find during a routine autopsy, a discovery that would test the limits of their understanding and leave them with more questions than answers. At the time, Death was understood through a limited scientific lens. The prevailing theory was that death occurred when the body's vital functions ceased: breathing, heartbeat, and the circulation of blood. It was believed that once these functions stopped, the body immediately began the process of decomposition. Rigor mortis would set in, followed by the breakdown of tissues by bacteria and enzymes. But this case in Naples was different. When the autopsy was performed, the physicians found that, instead of following the usual path of decomposition, the woman's internal organs were growing, something no one had ever seen before. Her organs, in a state of what appeared to be continued growth, defied the known understanding of biology. At first, the doctors involved were baffled. What could cause such a phenomenon? It was beyond the scope of their knowledge and could not be explained by any of the existing medical theories. There was no precedent for what they were witnessing. Their minds raced with possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. Some speculated that the organs were in a state of suspended animation, that the woman had somehow been in a liminal state between life and death. Others suggested that there might be a scientific explanation hidden in the depths of their understanding. Perhaps some rare medical condition or unique anatomical anomaly had caused the organs to grow even after the person's heart had stopped beating. While the medical community in Naples tried to make sense of the findings, their inability to explain the phenomenon led them to question the very nature of life and death. Was there something that they didn't yet understand about the human body? Could death, in fact, be more of a gradual process than a sudden event? These questions, which had long been on the periphery of scientific inquiry, now moved to the forefront of intellectual debate. This case occurred in an era when scientific understanding was still in its infancy, and the world was only just beginning to grapple with new ways of thinking about the body and its functions. The ideas of dissection and anatomical study had existed for centuries, but the questions surrounding life and death had never been as pressing as they were in the mid-1700s. The Enlightenment brought with it a new philosophy, that knowledge could be gained through reason, observation, and experimentation. But even as this approach to understanding the world gained traction, the deeper mysteries of life remained elusive. The discovery of growing organs in a deceased body in Naples added to the already existing tensions between old and new beliefs. Some viewed it as a divine sign, an omen or a punishment, but others, particularly those who embraced the scientific method, saw it as a challenge to the emerging rationalist worldview. The case was one that could not be easily dismissed. It was a living, or rather, dead, example of the limits of medical knowledge and a reminder that the mysteries of the human body were far from fully understood. In the context of Naples at the time, the autopsy's results would have sent shockwaves through the local medical community. The city had long been a center for anatomical study, but even the most esteemed physicians there could offer no clear explanation for what had occurred. The practice of dissection was still controversial in the broader context of religious and cultural beliefs, and an event like this, where the body seemed to define nature, would have only intensified the divide between scientific thought and religious doctrine. For those who saw science as the path to understanding, this case would be both a puzzle and a challenge, an anomaly that required further investigation but also a sign that there was still much to learn. Naples, with its rich history of intellectual exploration, became the perfect backdrop for this strange event. It was a city that had seen centuries of political upheaval, artistic achievement, and intellectual debate. It was a place where the past and future collided, where the medieval world clashed with the dawn of modern science. The city had always been a crossroads, and in the case of this mysterious autopsy, it was once again a place where the limits of human knowledge were being tested. What had happened in Naples in 1764 would come to symbolize the uncertainty of the era, a time when humanity was reaching toward new frontiers in science, but still haunted by the unknowns of existence. This event in Naples, though overshadowed by the rapid advancements in science that would follow, stands as a stark reminder of the mysteries that continue to evade our understanding. In many ways, the scene that unfolded during that autopsy is emblematic of the larger struggles faced by 18th century scientists, the pursuit of knowledge in a world filled with uncertainty, where the line between fact and mystery was often hard to discern. The young woman at the center of this mysterious case was someone whose identity remains largely lost to history. Much of what we know about her comes from scattered historical accounts and the details of the autopsy itself, but beyond that, she is little more than a shadow, a name lost in the annals of time. What we do know, however, paints a picture of a tragic life marked by illness, premature death, and a final act of strange mystery that would forever link her to one of the most perplexing medical events in history. The woman, who would eventually come to be remembered as the subject of one of the most bizarre autopsies of the 18th century, was likely in her 20s, though exact details about her age and background remain unclear. She died under circumstances that, at first glance, seemed unremarkable. The cause of her death was not unusual for the time, an illness that, despite the best efforts of the physicians, ultimately claimed her life. In a world still deeply reliant on rudimentary treatments, many people succumb to conditions we would consider relatively minor today, such as infections, fevers, or complications from childbirth. Her death might have been perceived as a tragic but ordinary event. However, it was not the death itself, but what followed, that would make her case so extraordinary. Her passing triggered an autopsy, a standard procedure in the medical practices of the time, especially for those who died under unusual or unexplained circumstances. As was common in the 18th century, physicians sought to learn more about the human body by dissecting the deceased in an effort to understand the causes of death and the inner workings of anatomy. It was, to them, a method of both scientific inquiry and public service, as autopsies helped train new generations of doctors and allowed for more precise diagnoses in living patients. At the time, this process was still somewhat controversial, particularly within religious circles, which saw the dissection of the dead as an affront to the sanctity of the human body. When the autopsy began, the physicians likely expected to find the usual post-mortem signs of decomposition: rigor mortis, the stiffening of the muscles, the bluish discoloration of the skin as blood pooled in certain areas, and the gradual breakdown of tissues. But what they found instead was far more unsettling. The woman's organs, rather than being in a state of decomposition, appeared to be in a state of growth, as if the body was still alive, if only in some strange, unnatural way. The heart, the liver, and other internal organs were not as they should have been after death. Instead of showing signs of decay, they appeared to be functioning in a way that seemed to defy the natural order. This discovery was nothing short of baffling to the physicians who performed the autopsy. The organs seemed to be growing, developing, as if they were still alive, even though the woman's heart had long stopped beating. In a time when the scientific community was still trying to understand the most basic processes of life and death, this discovery raised questions that no one could answer. Was this a rare and previously unknown medical phenomenon? Was it a sign of some previously unrecognized stage of decomposition? Or, as some might have suggested, was it something far more sinister, an indication that the woman's soul had not yet departed, that her body was still in some way connected to the living world? For the physicians who witnessed the autopsy, this discovery was both a scientific marvel and a terrifying mystery. In an era when medicine was still filled with superstition and primitive understanding, there was no clear explanation for what they had found. Could it be that the line between life and death was not as clear-cut as had been assumed? Was it possible that the body could hold on to some vestige of life even after the heart had stopped beating? These were the questions that plagued the minds of the physicians who carefully examined the woman's body, trying to make sense of what they had uncovered. As strange and unsettling as the findings were, the autopsy also shed light on some of the medical practices of the time. In the 18th century, medical science was still in the midst of a transformation. The theories that had guided medicine for centuries, ideas about humors, the four elements, and divine influence over health, was slowly being replaced by the empirical study of the human body and the development of new methods of diagnosis. Still, despite these advancements, many medical practitioners continued to rely on traditional practices and had limited understanding of human physiology and pathology. The study of anatomy was in its infancy, and many physicians, even in a city like Naples, were still learning about the complexities of the human body by performing dissections and studying the organs post-mortem. The physician who performed the autopsy on the young woman was likely one of these dedicated, yet still imperfect, doctors. They would have been taught to follow a methodical approach to dissection, cutting open the body with precision in order to learn more about the cause of death and the nature of the organs within. But in this case, the physician would have had no way of knowing that what lay beneath the skin would defy everything they had been taught. Their training and knowledge were no match for the strange occurrence before them, and they could do little more than record the findings and try to make sense of what they had witnessed. The mysterious nature of the autopsy led to a number of conflicting interpretations. Some of the physicians, especially those who adhered to the more traditional medical views of the time, likely saw this discovery as an aberration, an isolated incident that had no real bearing on their understanding of the human body. Others, more progressive in their thinking, might have seen the findings as evidence of a deeper mystery, a sign that there were still vast gaps in their knowledge of the human body that needed to be filled. For some, the growing organs might have seemed like proof of a supernatural force at work. At the time, belief in spirits, divine intervention, and supernatural phenomena was still deeply ingrained in society. The Catholic Church's influence loomed large, and many people believed that death was not just a biological event but a spiritual one, in which the soul separated from the body and passed on to the afterlife. Some may have viewed the growing organs as a manifestation of a soul unwilling or unable to depart, or perhaps even as some divine sign meant to communicate a message to the living. This supernatural interpretation was not limited to religious figures. Even some members of the medical community might have been swayed by the power of belief. In a time when medical science was still in its infancy and deeply intertwined with mystical thinking, the idea that something beyond human comprehension could be responsible for such an event was not entirely out of the question. But as time went on, and as the case of the woman's autopsy spread, it became increasingly clear that this was not an isolated incident. Whether it was a case of misinterpretation, a rare medical anomaly, or something even more mysterious, the discovery of growing organs in a dead body raised more questions than it answered. It challenged the prevailing medical knowledge of the time, and it became clear that science would need to evolve further to understand the complex processes that occur at the moment of death, and what might happen beyond that moment. As strange as it seems today, the woman's death and the autopsy that followed became a critical point in the history of medicine. Her case was part of the slow, painful process through which medical science, with all its missteps and contradictions, began to take shape. While the exact details of her life and death may have been lost to time, the mystery of her autopsy continues to haunt the scientific community, reminding us that the human body, even in death, is full of surprises, some we may never fully understand. The autopsy began, as most did in the 18th century, with the usual expectations. The physician, trained in the rudimentary but growing field of human anatomy, would have prepared for a dissection that followed a well-established ritual. The body would be carefully examined and dissected in order to uncover the cause of death, a vital task for both medical research and the understanding of diseases. The first step was to perform a visual examination, a thorough inspection of the body's external appearance. The color of the skin, the state of the body, and the presence of any injuries or deformities would be recorded, providing the first clues as to what had happened in the final hours of the individual's life. But what was about to unfold on that cold, sterile operating table would deviate from the expected process, throwing all assumptions out the window. The woman's body was, at first glance, unremarkable, yet it had become the subject of this autopsy precisely because something about her death had aroused the curiosity of the physicians involved. They may have been suspicious of her condition, or perhaps there was an element of mystery surrounding the cause of death, but whatever prompted the decision to perform the dissection, they were not prepared for what would come next. The first incision was made. The physician's scalpel cut through the skin, which would have yielded easily, as it was soft and pliable from the initial stages of rigor mortis. Underneath the skin, the fatty tissue would have been exposed, often yellowed and slightly gelatinous in those who had died of natural causes. From there, the physician would typically continue with a systematic examination of the organs, starting with the chest cavity. The ribs would be carefully severed to allow access to the heart and lungs, the organs central to the life-sustaining functions of the body. In death, these organs, like all others, would begin to deteriorate as the natural process of decomposition set in. But here, something extraordinary happened. The physician would have been shocked to find that the heart, one of the first organs to be examined, showed no signs of decay, despite the fact that the woman had been dead for some time. It was not yet hardened or discolored from the usual post-mortem processes. It still appeared to be functioning, almost as though it was still alive, still pulsing with some unexplained force. This was not simply a case of unusual preservation or the kind of strange, slow decay sometimes seen in bodies preserved in cold environments. The heart appeared to be in a state of gradual development, not decay. The physician's heart would have raced as they moved on to the other organs, liver, lungs, kidneys, and intestines, all of which, to their astonishment, showed signs of growth. Instead of displaying the familiar signs of decomposition, these organs seemed as though they were still undergoing cellular activity, as though they were still growing, still developing, still alive in some unnatural way. The liver, which in the early stages of decomposition would have begun to break down, remained strangely intact, its cells still appearing fresh, even though they should have been well past the point of decay. The kidneys, too, showed no signs of postmortem changes, but rather, they seemed to be developing at an accelerated rate, their tissue still active, still growing. It is almost impossible to imagine the confusion and horror that the physician must have felt. The body they had opened, expecting to find a process of decomposition and decay, seemed to defy all known laws of biology. What was happening? Why were the organs growing when they should have been breaking down? Was this some unknown disease or condition that allowed the body to continue functioning even after death? Or was it something more? Could the body still be alive, or at least, partially so? The physicians involved in the autopsy were trained in the science of their day, but they were by no means prepared for such a phenomenon. They had no framework, no theories, and no tools to understand what they were witnessing. Even as the examination continued, the mystery deepened. The organs were growing, but what did that even mean? Were they somehow regenerating, as if the body had found some way to reverse the normal process of death? Was there some unknown factor at work, perhaps a new biological process that had never been observed before? As the autopsy proceeded, the physicians likely attempted to explain away what they were seeing. They would have considered all possibilities, illusions, errors in their observations, or a fluke caused by external conditions like temperature or humidity. Yet none of these explanations could adequately account for what was unfolding before them. There was no scientific precedent for such an event, no medical theory that could explain the phenomenon. In a world where science was still grappling with basic concepts like the circulatory system, disease, and infection, this discovery seemed to break all the rules of life and death. The physicians may have been too stunned to act, too overwhelmed by the unexpected to continue with their examination in the usual manner. Perhaps they attempted to document the findings, writing down every detail of what they saw, even as their minds raced with the implications of what was happening. They may have even wondered if this was a test, some kind of divine intervention, a miracle, or omen meant to reveal a greater truth. The growing organs in the woman's body raised a multitude of questions, many of which would remain unanswered for centuries. The response to this unusual finding would have been mixed, even within the small circle of physicians involved in the autopsy. Some may have dismissed it as an anomaly, a rare occurrence that had no significance beyond the moment. But for others, especially those more inclined towards scientific inquiry, it would have been a moment of profound significance, a mystery that demanded further investigation. This strange discovery, after all, was not just about one woman's body. It was a challenge to everything that had been understood about life, death, and the human body. As news of the autopsy spread, it would have created a ripple effect throughout the medical community, igniting debates and discussions. Some may have believed the growing organs were evidence of a deeper, more profound mystery, perhaps a sign that death was not an absolute state but a gradual transition that could take longer than previously thought. Others, more conservative in their views, may have seen it as a freak occurrence, a bizarre quirk of nature that had no wider implications. But the fact remained that this was not a simple case of a body failing to decompose in the usual manner. The organs inside the woman's body were not merely preserved. They were growing, changing, exhibiting signs of life. It was as if the natural boundaries between life and death had been temporarily erased. The implications of this discovery were far-reaching, far beyond the understanding of the time. What did it mean for the study of death? What did it say about the boundaries of life? Could the human body retain some vestige of life after death, or was this simply an anomaly that could never be explained? For the physicians involved, the autopsy likely raised more questions than answers. The growing organs would have seemed to challenge everything they thought they knew about biology. If these organs could continue growing after death, what did that mean for our understanding of life itself? What did it say about the human body's potential, its limitations, and its ultimate fate? The autopsy may have provided some clues, but it also revealed the vast unknowns that remained. It was a stark reminder that, no matter how much we know about the human body, there is always more to discover, more to understand, and perhaps even more to fear. As the physicians continued their dissection, the strange discovery began to weigh heavily on them. They had expected to find a body in the typical stages of decay, the usual processes of rigor mortis and the breakdown of tissues, yet what they uncovered defied every expectation. The most unnerving part of the examination was the organs. Instead of deteriorating, as one would expect after death, they were continuing to grow, developing in a way that seemed completely unnatural. This phenomenon raised a multitude of questions that the physicians had no answers for. At the time, the understanding of life and death was still in its infancy. Most medical practitioners, even in intellectual centers like Naples, were still learning about the basic workings of the human body. The discovery that internal organs could somehow continue to grow long after the death of the body was not just an anomaly. It was a medical enigma that sent ripples of uncertainty through the minds of all who witnessed it. The implications were staggering, but the ability to make sense of it was far beyond the scope of the science available to them. The physicians, who would have been trained in the traditional methods of dissection, knew that once death occurred, the body underwent a predictable series of changes. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of the muscles, would typically set in within hours of death, followed by the breaking down of tissues due to bacterial and enzymatic activity. This was the natural course of things. The heart would stop beating, blood would begin to pool in various parts of the body, and the organs would gradually lose their vitality as decomposition began. The body would enter a stage of decay, and over time, it would be reduced to a skeleton. What they were witnessing, however, was entirely different. The organs, including the liver, heart, and kidneys, were showing signs of activity. They seemed to be growing, not decaying. There was a sense that the body had not fully given up its life force, that something in the body was still functioning, still trying to maintain life in some way. This raised an unsettling possibility. Was it possible that the woman's body was not truly dead? Could the traditional understanding of death be wrong? Was there a hidden phase between life and death, a state that was neither fully alive nor completely dead, in which the body could continue to grow? The physicians involved in the autopsy could have been tempted to attribute this phenomenon to the supernatural. After all, the boundaries between the natural world and the spiritual were still not clearly defined in the minds of many people at the time. Death was often viewed as a transition to another realm, with the soul leaving the body and the body becoming a mere shell. The idea of a soul still lingering in the body, or some divine intervention keeping the body alive in some way, would have seemed plausible to many in an age where religious beliefs were deeply interwoven with daily life. Some may have even believed that this strange event was a sign or a miracle, an omen meant to convey some deeper spiritual meaning. The idea that a body could continue to grow after death might have been interpreted as evidence of the body's immortality, a divine message that there was more to life and death than the physical world could explain. Others, more inclined toward rational thought, might have considered the possibility that the body had entered some unusual physiological state. Perhaps some unknown disease or condition had caused this phenomenon, keeping the body in a state of suspended animation. But as the dissection continued, the mystery only deepened. There was no clear explanation. The body did not exhibit the usual signs of life, the heart was not pumping, and there was no circulation of blood. The woman's body was cold to the touch, her skin pale and lifeless. Yet, somehow, the organs appeared to be growing, as though they were still functioning in some strange, dormant way. Was this a form of reanimation? A glimpse of something beyond the natural processes of life and death? Or was this something far more mundane, a medical anomaly that had never been seen before? It was impossible to say for sure. The physicians who conducted the autopsy were likely perplexed and even frightened by what they were witnessing. They had no way of knowing whether they were looking at a rare, isolated case, or if this discovery would challenge everything they knew about the human body. Even the most well-established medical theories of the time could not account for the phenomenon they were seeing. Over the next few days, rumors began to spread about the strange autopsy in Naples. Word of the discovery reached other physicians and medical practitioners in the city, and soon the mystery became the talk of the medical community. Many questioned the validity of the findings, suggesting that perhaps the organs had simply been preserved in an unusual way, or that some form of external factor had caused them to appear to be growing. Others dismissed the case as an anomaly, a freak occurrence that had no bearing on the larger field of medical science. But for a growing number of physicians, this case raised questions that could not be easily dismissed. Some suggested that the woman's body had entered a state of suspended animation, in which the normal processes of death were delayed. This would have been an extraordinary idea for the time, but it was not entirely without precedent. The phenomenon of suspended animation had been discussed by some philosophers and scientists, who speculated that the human body might be capable of entering a state of temporary stasis, in which all metabolic activity slowed down, yet the body was not entirely dead. This theory, though not widely accepted, was intriguing enough to warrant consideration. Others, more familiar with emerging medical ideas, might have suggested that the woman's body had been affected by some rare condition, one that prevented the normal decay of tissues. It was known that certain diseases and conditions, like tuberculosis or syphilis, could cause unusual changes in the body's tissues after death, leading to preservation or strange appearances. Perhaps the woman had suffered from a disease that caused her organs to remain unusually well preserved, giving the illusion of growth. In any case, the discovery led to a flurry of speculation, but no definitive answers. The woman's case was an isolated incident, and while it stirred up great interest, it did not lead to any immediate breakthroughs in the study of anatomy or physiology. It would take many years, even centuries, before scientists would begin to understand the complex processes of life, death, and decomposition with the depth we possess today. The theories that were proposed at the time were speculative at best, grounded in a mixture of ancient knowledge, superstition, and early attempts at rational thought. Yet, despite the lack of definitive answers, the autopsy in Naples marked a turning point in the way physicians thought about the human body and death. It opened up new questions, many of which would remain unanswered for generations. The idea that the body could exhibit signs of life after death was an unsettling and mysterious concept, one that challenged the very foundations of medical science at the time. And while the woman's case may have been a rare and isolated event, it served as a stark reminder of the many mysteries of the human body that remained, waiting to be uncovered. The mystery of the growing organs became a part of the larger tapestry of medical history, one that spoke to the unknowns that scientists and doctors were still grappling with. It was a puzzle that could not be solved, a question that lingered in the minds of those who heard the tale. And though modern science has advanced far beyond the rudimentary understanding of the 18th century, the questions raised by that strange autopsy continue to echo through the ages, a reminder that there are still aspects of life, death, and the human body that we have yet to fully understand. As news of the bizarre autopsy in Naples spread throughout the medical community, the event quickly evolved from a local curiosity into a larger intellectual and scientific puzzle. The discovery of organs growing within a body long after death had captured the imagination of not just physicians, but also scholars, philosophers, and even the general public. For those in the medical field, the implications were profound. What could this mean for their understanding of the human body, its life cycle, and the processes of death? More importantly, how could this strange phenomenon be explained when existing knowledge offered no clear answers? The physicians who had performed the autopsy were at the center of this storm, trying to piece together an explanation for the anomaly they had witnessed. Some of them were deeply troubled by what they had seen. After all, their careers had been built on understanding the predictable processes of life and death. The discovery that the woman's organs were growing instead of decomposing was a direct challenge to everything they had been taught. They would have understood that the biological processes they relied on in their medical practice, the cessation of heartbeats, the stoppage of blood flow, and the gradual breakdown of tissues, were universal. Death, in their view, was a clearly defined and irreversible event. The woman's organs continued to grow, not out of some medical explanation they could pinpoint, but as though something unnatural had intervened. In the absence of clear medical explanations, some of the more superstitious physicians might have been tempted to attribute the phenomenon to the supernatural. The 18th century was a time when many believed that life and death were governed by divine or mystical forces. Death was often seen as a spiritual event, not just a biological one, and many believed that the soul departed the body to move on to the afterlife. If the woman's organs were growing after her death, then, to some, it might seem as though the body was somehow still connected to the living world, as though the soul had not yet fully departed. This view, while unscientific, reflected the widespread influence of religious and supernatural beliefs that colored much of the thinking at the time. The possibility that this event might be related to divine or otherworldly forces created a sense of unease. What if the body was still somehow alive, or if the soul was trapped in a liminal space between life and death? These unsettling thoughts must have haunted the physicians, especially in the context of a deeply religious society where questions of life after death were often fraught with fear, guilt, and superstition. The idea of a body that refused to decompose, or that appeared to be growing rather than decaying, could easily be interpreted as a sign that the woman's death was somehow unnatural. Whether divine intervention or an angry spirit held her body in some kind of stasis, it was unsettling to think that the line between life and death could be so porous. On the other hand, those physicians who were more inclined towards scientific reasoning would have viewed the autopsy with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. They would have questioned the accuracy of their observations and examined the possibility that what they had seen was a result of an error, a misinterpretation, or an unusual medical condition that they were unfamiliar with. They were operating within a limited scientific framework, and the 18th century understanding of anatomy and physiology had significant gaps. While some physicians might have speculated that the woman had been suffering from a rare condition, others might have dismissed the phenomenon entirely as an anomaly with no further significance. At this point, the case had become something of a medical mystery, and the debate surrounding it began to grow. Physicians, scholars, and even laypeople across Europe started discussing the autopsy, trying to figure out what had caused the woman's organs to behave so strangely after her death. Some of the more progressive thinkers began to ask whether the body's internal processes could be more complex than previously imagined. Could there be some unknown biological mechanism, a third state of life, that bridged the gap between life and death? Some speculated that the body could enter a state of suspended animation, one in which the usual processes of decomposition were delayed, and certain bodily functions could continue, albeit in a different way. As the intellectual discourse continued, a few scientists and physicians began to develop new theories in an attempt to understand the phenomena they had witnessed. One possibility that was explored was the notion that the woman's body might have entered a form of metabolic stasis or hibernation after death. In hibernation, for example, animals experience a slowing of their metabolic processes, which allows them to survive extreme conditions for a time. Could the woman's body have undergone a similar process, in which her organs were not fully shut down, but instead remained in a state of suspended animation? Another hypothesis was based on the concept of cadaveric spasm, a rare and poorly understood phenomenon in which certain muscles or tissues in a dead body appear to contract or twitch after death. While cadaveric spasm typically involves small, involuntary movements rather than growth, some physicians may have speculated that it was a related phenomenon. Was it possible that a similar process was taking place in the organs, allowing them to continue growing instead of decomposing? It was an intriguing idea, but still far from conclusive. The most rational explanation that began to gain traction, however, was rooted in the developing field of pathology. Some physicians suggested that the woman may have suffered from an underlying illness that caused her body to preserve itself unusually after death. For example, certain diseases, such as tuberculosis or syphilis, can cause the tissues of the body to become unusually resistant to decay after death. Perhaps the woman had a rare, unknown disease that caused her organs to be unusually well preserved, leading to the illusion of growth. Yet, despite these emerging hypotheses, no one could definitively explain the phenomena witnessed during the autopsy. The event highlighted the limits of 18th century medical knowledge. Medicine was in the midst of a major transformation, with the rise of new theories about disease and the development of more systematic methods of observation. However, the understanding of human biology was still in its infancy. There were no advanced tools for examining cellular structure, no reliable ways to understand the complex biochemical processes that governed life and death. What they had observed was a challenge to the very foundations of biological science. The growing organs were an anomaly that couldn't be accounted for by the knowledge available to them at the time. At the same time, the event in Naples served as a powerful reminder of how little scientists of the period truly understood about the human body and its processes. The boundaries between life and death were still mysterious, and many fundamental questions about human biology remained unanswered. The discovery of the growing organs forced physicians to confront these questions head-on, and the unanswered mystery became an enduring symbol of the unknowns that still surrounded human biology. Despite the lack of a clear explanation, the case of the woman's autopsy ultimately had a lasting impact. It forced the medical community to reconsider their understanding of the natural world and the transition between life and death. The event, while still shrouded in mystery, inspired new questions, new ideas, and new investigations. And while the exact cause of the woman's growing organs may never have been uncovered, her case highlighted the importance of skepticism, observation, and continued inquiry in the pursuit of medical knowledge. The debate surrounding the autopsy didn't just spark interest in the medical community, it also inspired widespread fascination among the public. It fed into the growing public interest in strange medical phenomena, a trend that would continue for centuries. People were captivated by the idea of a body that refused to decompose, and the story of the mysterious autopsy in Naples became part of the lore surrounding medical history. Though much of the detail surrounding the woman's life and the circumstances of her death have been lost to history, the mystery of her autopsy endures as one of the most perplexing and unsettling cases in the annals of medical science. It serves as a reminder of the limits of human knowledge, of how even in the age of reason and science, the mysteries of life, death, and the human body continue to elude our understanding. Even today, the questions raised by that strange autopsy remain unanswered, leaving us to wonder if there is more to the process of life and death than we have yet discovered. As the autopsy in Naples continued to reverberate through medical circles, the ramifications of the strange event reached beyond the confines of the immediate medical community. While the direct aftermath of the case was primarily confined to the physicians and scholars who had examined the woman's body, the broader societal implications began to take shape as the news spread. Public curiosity, mixed with skepticism and fear, began to grow. To some, the autopsy was simply another unsettling reminder of the mysteries of life and death that humanity had yet to understand. To others, it was a confirmation of their darkest fears about the unknown forces that govern the natural world. The discovery of organs continuing to grow in a deceased body was not just a matter of medical interest. It was a cultural and philosophical shockwave that would leave an indelible mark on society. The scientific world was, of course, deeply affected by the event, but the public's reaction was markedly different. In the 18th century, most people had a deeply religious and spiritual understanding of life and death. The dominant worldview was that death was an absolute boundary, one from which no one could return. The body's decomposition was seen as the final stage of life, a natural process that occurred when the soul left the physical vessel. The idea that the body could resist this natural process, that it could exhibit signs of life after death, was incomprehensible to many. To the superstitious and the religiously devout, this discovery might have been seen as an omen, a warning that the natural order had been violated. For those who were less inclined towards supernatural explanations, the event raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of life itself. What did it mean for the boundary between life and death? Could death really be a gradual process, not a sudden and absolute cessation of life? Could the body, after losing its pulse and breath, still hold on to something that allowed for the continuation of certain biological functions? These were the kinds of questions that unsettled both the scientific and philosophical communities. The case seemed to suggest that there were hidden realms of biology and physiology that had yet to be uncovered, potentially forces in the body that could transcend the known laws of nature. As the story spread across Europe, it also caught the attention of philosophers and theologians, who wrestled with the ethical and metaphysical implications of what had been observed in Naples. Many philosophers, especially those influenced by the Age of Enlightenment, were engaged in a broad rethinking of the human body, its connection to the soul, and the mechanisms of life and death. The Enlightenment emphasized reason, empiricism, and scientific inquiry as the primary means to understand the world, but it also struggled with questions that were still deeply tied to religious and spiritual thought. The phenomenon in Naples seemed to embody the very tension between these two competing worldviews. On one side, there was the growing influence of scientific exploration, the idea that the human body could be studied, understood, and even potentially controlled by human hands. On the other side, there was the immovable belief that life and death were governed by divine will, and that the human soul was far beyond the reach of science or rational thought. Some of the more religious thinkers who heard about the autopsy might have seen the continuing growth of the organs as evidence of the divine, even if they could not explain it. For some, the idea of the body resisting decomposition was reminiscent of biblical stories of resurrection, of the idea that the dead could somehow be brought back to life. This concept, while not strictly related to the growing organs in Naples, played into a broader cultural narrative of life after death, spiritual resurrection, and divine intervention. It was the kind of mystery that might have been interpreted as a sign of God's power, or perhaps as a warning that human understanding of life and death was far more limited than previously thought. For others, however, this discovery was a direct challenge to religious views of death, implying that the human body was not just a vessel for the soul, but a complex biological system that could, in some unknown way, transcend the moment of death. While these philosophical and theological debates swirled, the broader medical community was not as easily satisfied with supernatural explanations. For physicians and scientists of the time, the mystery of the woman's growing organs represented a failure of their understanding. While Enlightenment thinkers had begun to believe in the power of reason and empirical evidence to explain all natural phenomena, this event suggested that some things simply could not be understood by the methods they had available. The growing organs, though fascinating, were an indication that there were forces at work in the human body that they had no framework to comprehend. To the rationalists, the event presented a profound challenge to their belief in the physical and predictable laws of nature. Could the body hold secrets that could not be unraveled by simple observation and experimentation? Was it possible that the transition from life to death was not as final as they had assumed? Could the idea of decomposition be misunderstood? Was the body truly dead when physicians thought it was, or was there some intermediate phase in which the body retained a kind of strange, dormant life? At the time, much of the work of modern medicine was still in its infancy. Many of the diagnostic tools and scientific methods we take for granted today had yet to be invented. Physicians in Naples, like those elsewhere in Europe, relied heavily on observation, deduction, and anatomical dissection to understand the human body. But these methods had limitations. Without a sophisticated understanding of cellular biology, microbiology, or biochemistry, physicians could only make observations and attempt to interpret them within the frameworks of existing medical knowledge. This event showed just how limited that knowledge was. While the growing organs may have been a rare, isolated event, they exposed the vast gaps in the medical science of the time, gaps that would take centuries to fill. As debates over the phenomenon unfolded, a few medical practitioners and scholars began to entertain more speculative theories. Some posited that the woman's organs had been preserved in some way that prevented normal decay. This theory had some merit, as certain conditions, like cold temperatures or the presence of certain chemicals, could delay the usual processes of decomposition. However, the idea that the organs were actually growing, and not just preserved, was harder to explain. Some scientists began to suggest that the body had undergone some form of metabolic stasis, a kind of suspended animation that allowed the organs to continue their activity long after the body had ceased its normal functions. This idea was radical at the time and received little support, but it nevertheless set the stage for future investigations into what we now know as metabolic processes and the biological mechanisms that can cause the body to react in unexpected ways after death. Though this theory was not widely accepted, it did open up new areas of inquiry, prompting physicians and biologists to consider the body's potential for unusual states of being that went beyond simple death and decomposition. The story of the growing organs was not just an intellectual curiosity, it also struck a chord with the broader public. People were fascinated by the idea that there might be secrets hidden within the human body, secrets that had eluded even the most learned physicians and philosophers. The story fed into popular fears and fascinations with death and the afterlife, as well as the growing interest in the occult, superstition, and even medical curiosities of the time. It was a reflection of the growing public obsession with mysteries that were not easily explained, things like ghost stories, tales of resurrections, and the supposed powers of the dead. These stories were widely circulated, often in exaggerated forms, adding to the already intense sense of mystery surrounding the autopsy. Yet, despite all the theories, debates, and cultural fascination, the truth about the woman's growing organs would remain elusive. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, and as the study of biology and medicine advanced, new discoveries in cellular biology, pathology, and the nature of life and death began to shed light on many of the questions raised by this strange event. While the specific details of the Naples autopsy were lost to time, the questions it raised about the boundaries between life and death, about the resilience of the human body, and about the limits of medical knowledge would continue to influence the development of medical science for generations to come. The mystery of the woman's organs serves as a reminder of the vastness of what remains unknown about the human body and its processes. Even with all the scientific advancements we have made, the line between life and death remains a murky, mysterious territory, one that continues to provoke both fascination and fear, even in the modern age. In the years following the Naples autopsy, the incident continued to captivate the imagination of not just physicians and philosophers, but of the broader public as well. While some may have dismissed the event as a curious anomaly, others found it impossible to ignore. As time passed, and medical science evolved, the questions raised by the phenomenon would not fade away. Instead, they became emblematic of the continuing struggle between science and superstition, reason and mystery, as humanity grappled with its understanding of life, death, and the complex processes in between. The very idea that the body, after death, could show signs of life or growth seemed to shatter all preconceived notions about biology. For centuries, death had been perceived as an absolute, an irreversible event that marked the boundary between the living and the dead. Once the heart stopped beating, and once the breath ceased, the body was considered a mere shell, soon to undergo the inevitable decomposition process. This belief was foundational to medical knowledge of the time. Yet the events in Naples, where internal organs continued to grow even after the woman's death, forced the medical community to confront the unsettling possibility that their understanding of life and death might be flawed or incomplete. This phenomenon, despite its rarity, would slowly begin to spark new lines of inquiry into the very nature of life. Could the body experience a period of stasis, where it appeared dead yet still held onto some fragment of life, some mechanism that allowed certain processes to continue? The idea of suspended animation, once confined to the realm of fantasy and science fiction, began to receive serious attention. Medical pioneers and theorists began to reconsider the possibility that the body could enter an intermediate state between life and death, one in which biological processes could persist or even restart. While the incident in Naples was still largely regarded as an oddity, it was enough to challenge existing dogma. Physicians of the era were largely working within the constraints of a relatively primitive understanding of the body's internal workings. The 18th century was a time when medicine was slowly but surely moving away from superstitious and theological explanations of illness and death, but the tools available for studying the body at a cellular or molecular level were practically non-existent. For example, There were no microscopes powerful enough to explore the fine details of cellular processes or to examine the biochemical reactions that govern life and death. Medical knowledge was based largely on visible and tangible evidence, gross anatomy, the study of the body's larger structures, and the limited understanding of circulatory and digestive systems. Yet the discovery in Naples suggested that this empirical framework was inadequate to fully explain what was happening in the body. The fact that the organs appeared to be growing after death pointed to a deeper mystery, one that was not easily solved with the tools and theories available at the time. For many, this pushed them to consider new approaches to studying the human body, particularly the transitions between life and death. Could there be an unknown factor, something in the body's physiology, that allowed certain tissues to retain vitality after death? Could there be biological mechanisms that kept certain processes from fully shutting down after death, mechanisms that we had yet to uncover? The concept of suspended animation was not new, but it had been largely relegated to the fringes of scientific discourse. Certain animals, like frogs, or certain types of fish, could enter states of hibernation or dormancy that drastically slowed their metabolic processes, allowing them to survive in extreme conditions. Some theories speculated that perhaps the woman's body had somehow entered a similar state, where the normal processes of decomposition were delayed or temporarily halted. It was a radical idea at the time, and though it gained traction among some forward-thinking scientists, it was also met with skepticism from others who viewed it as mere conjecture. As the years passed, new theories about life, death, and the mechanisms of the human body began to emerge, drawing on the findings from the autopsy in Naples. In the 19th century, advances in physiology and the development of the microscope allowed scientists to peer deeper into the inner workings of the body than ever before. Researchers began to understand more about the role of cells in life processes, how tissues grew, and how certain biochemical signals controlled growth and decay. These discoveries began to provide the tools needed to explore some of the unanswered questions left by the Naples autopsy. But even as medical science progressed, the events in Naples continued to stir the imaginations of those who sought to understand the deeper mysteries of the human body. In some ways, the case became a symbol of the unknown, a reminder that no matter how much science advanced, there would always be questions that could not easily be answered. The fact that the autopsy raised more questions than answers, and that the answers remained elusive for so long, ensured that it would remain in the public consciousness as one of the great mysteries of medical history. The woman at the center of the autopsy, whose name has been lost to time, became a figure of intrigue. While her story was obscured by centuries of speculation and mystery, her case continued to inspire scientific and popular interest alike. Medical journals, books, and articles discussed the strange event, often with a mix of awe and confusion. In some circles, it was seen as a cautionary tale about the limits of human knowledge, a reminder that there were still deep, unexplored territories within the human body that might defy all attempts to categorize or explain. Some proponents of the supernatural argued that the event was a sign of something beyond the natural world, perhaps even evidence of an afterlife or the workings of an otherworldly force. This perspective found a receptive audience among the more religious segments of society, who saw the growing organs as an indication that the woman's soul had not yet fully departed. To them, the phenomena were a sign of divine will, an act of God that could not be understood through scientific means. This line of thinking continued to fuel speculation about the nature of life, death, and the soul for generations to come. However, those with a more scientific bent resisted such spiritual explanations, insisting that the phenomenon, however baffling, had to have a logical, physical explanation, something that could eventually be uncovered by future generations of medical professionals. As medical science progressed into the 19th and 20th centuries, more advanced technologies like the microscope, which was first developed in the 17th century, began to offer new insights into the molecular workings of the body. By the late 19th century, researchers like Louis Pasteur, who studied fermentation and decay, were beginning to unravel the role of bacteria and microorganisms in the process of decomposition. These discoveries contributed to the growing body of knowledge that would eventually lead to the understanding of the life cycle at a cellular level. But the Naples autopsy, in its mystery, represented an important turning point. It was a moment in time when a seemingly inexplicable event challenged the boundaries of medical knowledge and philosophical thought. It laid bare the vulnerability of scientific inquiry when faced with the complexities of life and death. In many ways, it signaled a shift in the way science began to engage with the unknown, no longer as something to be feared or dismissed, but as something to be investigated and understood. Even as the autopsy's immediate shock faded from public attention, its legacy endured. It inspired future generations of medical practitioners and philosophers to look deeper into the body's secrets. The questions raised by the phenomenon about the nature of life, the threshold of death, and the potential for biological processes to persist in unusual ways continue to be relevant to this day. Modern medicine, with all its advances in biotechnology, genetics, and regenerative medicine, may not have an immediate answer to the puzzle that emerged in Naples, but it serves as a testament to the ongoing journey of discovery. In the end, the mystery of the growing organs in the dead body would not only remain unsolved for centuries, but it would continue to inspire a sense of wonder about the human body and its capabilities. The more we learn, the more we realize that there are still unknowns, hidden realms of biology and physiology that continue to defy explanation.